Hey guys, I'm Chris Buck and a very warm welcome to Friday Fretworks, and this week we're going to be taking a closer look at a rather interesting point in Fender's guitar making history, a point it could be argued that they went toe to toe with Gibson, that of course being the Fender Flame. Now, the Flame came as a part of the Fender Master Series, a series of guitars manufactured between 1983 and 1985, made exclusively at the Fujigen facility in Japan. This came at an interesting time for Fender, where they introduced three models simultaneously. You had the Flame, very much reminiscent of maybe a double cutaway Les Paul type guitar. You had a slightly larger body version then with symmetrical horns, reminiscent of a 335. And then lastly, you had the D'Aquisto, a hollow body archtop jazz style guitar. Now, these three models came at three different levels, or grades, if you will, ranging from the Standard to the Elite, which is what today's example of the Flame is taken from, finally with the Ultra. Now, we can tell from serial numbers that around about 3,665 guitars were manufactured, give or take, and this particular example is from February of 1984. So not only a fairly rare guitar, but a pretty early example of an otherwise sort of forgotten series. Now, as ever, a little bit of historical context is going to be important to the understanding of why these guitars were introduced. And during the 1980s, Fender were undergoing a little bit of a strange period. They had a bad reputation for quality control, couple that then with a dip in market share, all of which led the CBS management team to introduce a few new guys taken from the American arm of Yamaha, funnily enough, basically to try and overhaul Fender's fortunes. Now, one of the key guys involved in this was a guy called Dan Smith. Funnily enough, Dan was actually involved in the buyback of Fender from CBS in 1985, part of the management team which bought the company back, and Dan was charged with overhauling the guitar line at Fender. Now, two of the guitars which Dan was heavily involved in introducing were the Flame and the Esprit, both of which had older bodies, maple tops, set necks, so again fairly clear where they were kind of aiming at, and interestingly also had routed chambers. I found a great quote from Dan, which again gives some sort of insight into the thinking at the time. At that point, Gibson was turning out and they weren't selling very well. So we figured if we could get something and get some good players playing it and not worry about selling big quantities, get our name around and we can make set neck guitars like this, then we're going to do okay. The problem was we introduced the line, we had a pretty good response, but Fujigen had some manufacturing problems and we didn't get any guitars for over a year. So we introduced that to all this excitement and then nothing came for over a year. And then CBS pulled the plug. They were good guitars, they were made really well, they sounded good and everything else, but they weren't Fender. That attitude is our biggest asset and our biggest pain in the arse. Now, in regards to specifics of the Fender Flame, it's very clear to see where their inspiration lay. We have a slightly larger body than a Gibson Les Paul, but with dual offset cutaways, again reminiscent of an SG. You've got dual humbuckers, specially designed shallow humbuckers with a split coil mode, and fine tuners as well on the specially designed shallow bridge. Obviously, all of those appointments very much indicative of the fact that this was meant to be a more electronically versatile version of the Gibson Les Paul. Now, a later interesting point is that the Esprit was actually adopted by Robben Ford and was used very heavily on his Talk to Your Daughter album, which then in 1987 inspired Fender to reissue this guitar known as a Robben Ford signature guitar. Production of this ran from 1987 to 2002, during which time the manufacturing location changed several times, eventually ending up at the US Customs Shop before, as I said, being discontinued in 2002. The Esprit then had a bit of a swan song in 2005 when Dan Smith reworked the specs and it was introduced as a Korean-made Squier Esprit. So ultimately, I guess the overall question is, were these guitars considered a success? And unfortunately, I guess the answer very much lies in the fact that they were only actually produced for a period of 2 years. Now, it's interesting to read Dan Smith's thoughts on this, basically saying that in retrospect, as much as the public perception and the qualities of the guitars were very strong, ultimately the transitional phase in which Fender was in, basically being sold back to Fender from CBS, basically meant that the guitars weren't really given the chance to make the mark that they otherwise might have made. Now, either way, this is an incredibly well-made guitar. To my ears, at least, sounds a little bit more PRS-esque than maybe a Gibson Les Paul, but I guess either way, there's no arguing that in regard to humbucking guitars, this is a particularly good example of a guitar that probably should have made more of a splash than it actually did. Keep your eyes peeled for them. Unfortunately, they have started to fetch inflated prices now in the second-hand market, just for the fact that they are so rare, I think, amongst anything else. Although it is interesting to see that if nearly 4,000 were made, where the hell have they all gone? Because there are definitely not that many in circulation. As ever, I've been Chris Buck. This is Friday Fretworks. A massive thank you for watching. If you're a first-time watcher, please ring the bell below and subscribe. And I shall see you next week for another episode of Friday Fretworks. Cheers, guys. Take care. See you soon.